Now I would like to introduce our first speaker, Kelly Willenberg. I actually got to hear her speak last week, and she is a wealth of information. Kelly has worked in clinical trial billing for over 10 years and has extensive experience in clinical trials management and finance. She worked at Vanderbilt as the Director of Billing and Compliance with the distinction of setting up their program. She has presented over 70 times per year on various research compliance topics all over the country. She serves on the Research Compliance Academy faculty and helped to develop the curriculum. She's a member of ONS, ASCO, HCCA, AHLA, and AHIA, a whole bunch of organizations. And then she's also national speakers in the National Speakers Association. So that is, I'd like to welcome Kelly Willenberg. I don't know if you need it, but there's the thing. Oh, you want it?
I want that. Yeah, okay. And give me, I don't know if I'll use that because I'm going to move around too much probably. Okay, good morning. It's nice to see all of you today. I am thrilled to be here. I was sitting in the back of the room thinking when everybody was walking in that I think my last SWOG meeting was probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 years ago. And your new chair, Dr. Chuck Blanke, I was actually his research nurse on the GI team when I was at Vanderbilt, when I was first employed at Vanderbilt. So I feel like I have this connection, and I'm sort of an adopted stepchild for SWOG or something. But I also want to compliment and say that, you know, I do this work all over the country. I see billing issues, billing questions, billing problems. You know, just so you know, everybody's struggling with this. This is not something that's been easy. But I do clinical trial billing boot camps all over the country. And actually, I did one on Monday and Tuesday in San Diego. And 2 years ago, we did our first one in Chicago. And your administrator, program chair administrative person, Katie Stormer, who's in the back of the room, stand up. She was one of the people in the audience that day. And she has led the way getting cooperative groups on board with billing compliance. So I want to say hello and thank you to Katie. She answers questions when I have sites that are you know, having issues with understanding what they're supposed to do with cooperative groups if they aren't getting the tools that they need, because SWOG is actually supplying those tools. So I want you guys to realize that, you know, I might talk about some things that you don't understand or you didn't know about. And I put my business cards out because I have a flight today at 1:30. This is my 4th talk in 9 days. So I am going to go home for 36 hours and back out to Boston to do another talk on Sunday. So I gave you my card because I will answer your questions. I am an oncology nurse. I started out consenting patients at Denver Children's Hospital. I still have patients that was on Taxol when it was an IND drug who send me Christmas cards. I am here because I am one of you. So if you haven't ever been to something I've done and you are confused or you do have questions, please just let me know and I'll try to answer you or try to give you, you know, some where to go look, because there might be stuff in this talk that you don't know, and we're going to kind of play a little bit to see what you do know during the hour. So we're going to talk about what a coverage analysis is and what that means if you are or are not doing one. We're going to talk about the basic rules for how you bill, what you should be doing, and if you're not doing, what the implications might be. We're going to talk about the background as to why this all started and where we are in oncology research. And we're going to talk about what happens operationally. What do you have to do start to finish? You've got a study in the door. You have to figure out what you're going to do from a billing perspective. And then over here, you've put the patient on study, and there are bills going out to payers. What has to happen to those bills in order to be compliant? This is the cycle that we deal with in clinical research. And I think what you need to realize is you have to be doing every bit of this to be compliant in clinical research billing. You see at the top, we're going to go over what a coverage analysis is. Some people call it a billing plan. Some people call it a billing grid. Pharma sponsors who are doing it, who have learned and who have taken training, are calling it a cost coverage analysis or a cost analysis. Then we're going to talk about this budget, contract, and consent and how that impacts what you're doing on a daily basis. We're also going to talk about you can't do billing compliance without knowing who the subjects are. You have to know who they are when they go on study, when they go off study, so you can track them throughout the system, because something has to happen to their bills every time they see the doctor and a bill is generated throughout your system. We're going to talk about third-party billing. What's different, what's not, Medicare Advantage, what Medicare does, and what's coming down the pike with the Affordable Care Act. This is important because you have to have somebody on the back end that's looking at the charges. Sometimes they put the patient on a bill hold, and then they have to segregate. And in oncology, about 85 to 90% of the time, the bill is a split bill. Some of the items and services are routine and customary, and they would have had it minus the study, and some of the items might be paid for by the sponsor. Or they shouldn't be billed because that you cannot bill them under the guidelines. You have to be doing all of this, though, in order to be billing compliant. And down here at the bottom, this is auditing. Auditing is something that everybody says, oh, we don't like that word. It scares us. But most oncology sites now are doing some sort of self-monitoring to make sure that they are following the billing rules and that they're not billing incorrectly. And a lot of times, how you know if you're billing incorrectly is because the patient calls you and says, I got a bill and I thought it was all supposed to be for free. How many of you have heard that? Yes. That's the notorious notion that cancer patients have. And how many of you have heard over and over again from your PIs, well, that's standard of care. Okay, we're going to talk about those 3 words. When everybody leaves here today, you're not going to use those 3 words ever again. And for all the PIs in the room, and I have a couple of them sitting in here that I know pretty well, they're going to go home with a little bit of a different idea about standard of care. Because standard of care, when you have an audit, is very tricky. And I've sat in on audits with the OIG, the Office of Inspector General. I've been in on Medicare audits. I've been at places that have paid back millions of dollars because they've billed incorrectly in cancer research. Not a fun place to be. I want you to not be in that situation because you do not want to have to pay back money to the government. All right, what is a coverage analysis? I have prizes. So how many people in the room know what a coverage analysis is? There's some people in here that I've been at your site, so you better raise your hand. Okay. So, over here, who raised their hand? What is, oh, Lisa. Lisa, Spartanburg, they know. What about you? You're at? Would you pass this down to Lisa? So how about over here? Who's doing a coverage analysis at your site? Where are you? Loyola. Where are you? Yeah, you are. Your people have been to boot camp. And I know you are. Would you pass this down to her? So, a coverage analysis is something that you had better have in your person, in your files, if you ever have an audit. Because a coverage analysis is what is going to defend what you are billing. Now, what did I do with my... Oh. So, a coverage analysis identifies and analyzes who the appropriate payer is. It will tell you, after you have validated it, looked it up, justified everything that's on the study calendar, what is billable under the National Coverage Decision. It also helps you to know how to do a better budget. If you're not doing a coverage analysis, I'll be honest with you, I don't know how you're doing a good budget. And there are sponsors out there right now, some of them have had global training by moi, that are starting to send you coverage analysis. Don't not use it. Use it as a benchmark. Look at yours, look at theirs, or merge them, because they have in them they have validated to be billable under the National Coverage Decision. Is there anybody in the room that does not know what the National Coverage Decision is? Good. Okay, this is a coverage analysis. It's a template that you validate that the trial is qualifying under the guidelines. You validate what is billable, what is not billable, and you have it in a way that you can produce it if you are ever audited by any federal agency. Because Anita might not be there in 10 years, but Anita's documentation will be able to validate what she did 10 years ago. Because Medicare can request 10 years backward of your bills in clinical trial billing. These are the 4 Ps. In order to do a coverage analysis, you have to do a protocol review. Every single item or service on the schedule of events needs to be on your coverage analysis. Now let me just tell you, a lot of times not everything is on the schedule of events. It'll say chemistry, or it'll say hematology. And there might be 4 or 5 things that you need to order that have a CPT code that generates a charge description master through the system that somebody at the back end has to direct where it goes. It might be a CBC, a PT, and a PTT, but the only thing on the calendar is a hematology. And what do people assume? Okay, it's a 85025 CBC. And there's other things that have to be done. That all has to go on this coverage analysis, because the number of times that something's done is key in whether or not you can bill it. You also have to know the CPT code, the revenue code, the item code. These codes are required on the bills going to government payers. You want to make sure that if something's going to be billed, you know what that cost. And in cooperative group studies, part of the reason why it's very beneficial that some of the cooperative groups have actually gotten the idea that they need to be helping in this area is likely if they're doing this process, they're not going to send you something where there's something on the protocol that's a high ticket item that you can't bill and there's no money for. And I've been doing cooperative group studies 30 years. Let me just tell you, that's happened in the past numerous times. Patient review, I want to know the frequency and the day of service for every subject that the bill comes down in front of me. When I do billing audits, I match up calendars. I look to see where the patient is in the cycles. My team makes sure that if they come in for an unscheduled visit, what does the consent and the contract say for us to do to the bill? And then you have to know what expenses are going to go to research. Is there something that the cooperative group SWOG is paying for? Have they told you you have a stipend for every MUGA-scan? Because if you get a stipend for every MUGA-scan, you can't bill that MUGA-scan out. You have to stop that bill. Because if you send that bill out, you've committed billing fraud under Medicare. So, standard of care, not in the CMS guidelines, not recognized by Medicare. Most sponsors and clinical sites use that term, and a lot of physicians use that term. They think it means that if they say it's standard of care, it's billable. And there's things that we all think is standard of care that are not billable depending on what region of the country you live in, because all of our Medicare contractors dance to the beat of a different drum. Because if you live in Maryland, that Medicare contractor is stating, and he's put it in writing, no phase 1 study is ever billable. He doesn't care what you're doing. You can't bill it in that region. Most other regions, if you have done a coverage analysis, then you can defend that you've done an analysis of what is to be billed absent the trial, you're okay to bill it. Dr. Bernice Hecker, who is the Medicare contractor medical director for Noridian, which is Washington State, Oregon, Idaho, Salt Lake City, Utah, she's kind of flip-flop. At one point she said you can't bill anything phase 1, and now she will let you bill the routine cost minus the study as long as you've done your homework. And she is taking over California August 1st. Conventional care is a term that we use when we are training because it's a more broader, more objective standard that looks like what would the medical industry do? What would our physicians in Nashville, Tennessee treat? How would they treat a patient with melanoma? What's the standard practice? What are they doing? The national coverage decision was put in place in September of 2000 under Bill Clinton. It established criteria for which Medicare would pay for the routine costs for patients who wanted to participate in trials. Why did President Clinton do that? Because patients weren't going on trials. Patients were being told they couldn't go on trials. They were being denied care in trials. So they came up with a plan. So part of its purpose was to provide coverage. So a Medicare beneficiary didn't give up their benefits to participate in a trial. And we all know in cancer, there are certain things, certain rare tumor types that if you're not participating in a trial, you're not getting the best care. So this was good. It's complicated though. And they've tried to change it 2 or 3 times, and they've even had a place in October 2007 where everybody inputted. We all went to Washington and danced on the Capitol and told them what they needed to do, and they didn't really listen to us. And it really, what it boils down to, and it's still today, that started in 2000, Medicare pays for routine cost in qualifying trials. Now, the problem is you have to know what the routine costs are and you have to be able to defend them, and you have to know whether or not the trial is qualifying. And not every trial is qualifying under the guidelines. This is how you determine a qualifying trial. The trial itself has to meet all three in the right-hand column in the green. The trial has to have a Medicare benefit category. The item or service has to fall into that. 99% of the trials that you do in oncology fall under the Medicare benefit category of drug and biologics. It has to have therapeutic intent, which means you have to be measuring something. You have to be careful that you're not just testing to see if the drug is toxic. And you have to be very careful that you don't negate that therapeutic intent in your consent form by saying you will not receive benefit by participating in this trial. Auditors from the federal government and the OIG and Medicare like, you may or may not receive benefit from participating in this trial. That's what needs to go in your consent form. You have to enroll patients with a diagnosed disease. Where does this trip us up? When a patient is considered cancer-free or they're in a prevention trial. There are Medicare contractors in the country that will tell you no prevention trial is ever billable under the guidelines. But you don't know this unless you're qualifying the study. On the left-hand side, you see the 4 types of trials that meet the 7 desirable characteristics. Don't try to do the math because it doesn't do well. It's kind of what I call monopoly money. What you got to know on the left-hand side is your trial has to meet one of those criteria to be deemed. Cooperative group studies usually meet 3 of the 4, so you're golden. Because they're funded by the NIH, they're funded by a cooperative group, and usually they have an IND. Where you get into trouble with this side and this type of problem is when a trial is an investigator-initiated trial and you do not know whether or not you need an IND exemption and nobody's thought about it. So, routine costs include items or services that are typically provided absent the trial. But how are you going to decide that? How many of you would let your physicians decide what is standard of care, what is routine? How many of you let your physician circle on the grid or the schedule of events and send it back to you? Okay? How many of you take what the sponsor tells you? If they tell you something is standard of care, or they put an SOC on your calendar, do you just accept that? How many of you question things that come in? Go ahead, but don't be shy, that's good. That's what you should be doing. You should be thinking about when it comes to you, okay, is it an item or service that we're solely doing for the trial? Or is it something we're doing solely for the provision of the investigational drug? And what does that mean? If you have an investigational drug, does the infusion fall under the coverage decision? The infusion, the pre-meds, the fluid, the special tubing. Do you bill that to your payer or do you remove that from your bill? You bill it. In a qualifying clinical trial, that is considered a routine cost. So if it's a SWOG 2-arm study and one of the arms they add an investigational drug to the arm and you're giving 2 routine drugs in both arms, those 2 routine drugs go billable, everything's fine. The only thing you got to make sure you remove off the bill is the drug that's investigational. The tubing, the fluid, the pre-meds, anything that's required for the provision of that study drug is actually billable. So when a sponsor says to you they'll pay for that, what should you tell them? What? Routine care. Tell them you don't want them to pay for it. Because why is that complicated? It's a 3-drug cocktail. Your investigational drug is the middle drug, and guess what? You got to get that drug, that infusion, that tubing, that pre-med, all that off the bill if you are paid for that at fair market value and if you promise it for free in the informed consent. So be careful what you accept in your documents from your sponsors. Now, you won't get this stuff from SWOG because SWOG knows what they're doing. But you might get this from other cooperative groups. So think about when you get something in, if it's the investigational drug, you can actually bill that to a payer. The clinically appropriate monitoring of the effects of the item or service or the prevention of complications. So, you have a drug that causes liver toxicities. You're going to have to do SGOTs, SGPTs, amylase, and LDH while the patient's on study. Can you bill those? Stephen says yes. Can you bill those? Anybody say no? Because you are monitoring the effects of that study drug. That's part of your coverage analysis then. You have validated that what you're doing is monitoring or preventing or treating the toxicity of the study drug. Let's just say the patient becomes neutropenic and ends up having to go in the hospital, be admitted, have IV antibiotics as a result of the study drug. Is that admission billable in a qualifying trial? Yes. Don't let a sponsor promise you that they'll pay for that, because then you have to track down that bill. And likely it's going to go out before you know about it, or you are able to stop the bill. The items and services needed for the reasonable and necessary care arising from the provision with the complications is billable. Do not accept payment for that from sponsors, because it complicates your life. Routine costs do not include the drug that they give to you, the device that they give to you, and it doesn't include things that it states in the protocol is being done just for the protocol. If it says biopsy on day 8 is being done exclusively for research purposes only and you are submitting that data, you better make sure you know what's in that protocol, because I guarantee you an auditor will find that and they will make sure that you did not bill it. You also want to make sure that anything that's given to the patient for free is not billed. If you promise it at no cost, you cannot bill it. So be careful what is in your consent language, because patients tend to think, I'm in a clinical trial, all my care is free. And what the problems we had at Vanderbilt when I was there is we gave the patients these little orange cards at first when we started billing compliance, and what did they start doing? They started showing that card. What? They did. They would show that card. They'd be in a motorcycle accident in the ER, and they'd show that research card, and I'd get their bill. And I'd call the billing office and say, whoa, wait a minute, we're not paying for that. And I really had to pause when we started getting them in like hundreds a day, and at the top of the bill it had Kelly Willenberg. And I said, can you change that to clinical trials office or billing compliance? Because Kelly Willenberg's not covering that bill. But patients thought that. And the bad thing is that patients' families think that too. So when you're consenting a patient, make sure you tell the patient exactly what you're covering, what you're doing, and document in a consent note what you told them. Because when I've been in on audits, and I've actually had to be an expert witness a couple times for consent form problems, what you tell the patient always wins. Always wins. And if a lawyer, do I have any lawyers in the room? One? Are you a lawyer? Well, if there's no lawyers, we'll talk about them. Because I play one on TV most of the time. But here's the thing. If a lawyer can make it murky or make it so the patient wins or it errs on the side of the patient, they do. So be careful that you aren't, all protocol services are provided at no cost to you. Well, protocol services, does that mean routine? Does that mean not? Be careful what you put in your consent forms. So, other Medicare rules apply. Your NCDs are your national coverage decisions, which is what you're going to get from SWOG, which is what you're going to get from sponsors that are doing this process. There's LCDs. Does everybody know what an LCD is? Local coverage decision. That is based on where you live and what your Medicare contractor does. They all have different ideas. Some of them have a lot of local coverage decisions and medical articles and things like that. Some of them have none. But they're a moving target because there's regions of the country that are moving again with their medical director. The secondary payer rule is pretty big, but it's really bigger in pharma, in sponsored research, because you really can't allow the sponsor to agree to pay for something in a trial once you get a denial. And we all know sponsors put that in their contracts all the time. You should not accept that language, especially for injury. Because once you put that in there, you have triggered the Medicare secondary payer rule. And what Medicare says is, it's just like if you have workman's comp. They need to pay first. You had a payer. We're not paying. So be careful of that language in your industry trials. So these are the 5 deadly sins. If you learn nothing from me today, do not use the word standard of care and know these 5 things on the screen. You cannot bill for services that are paid for by the sponsor. Period. I don't care. It doesn't matter. If it's on a grid or it has a dollar amount and it's fair market value, an auditor will say you shouldn't have billed it. That means you got to be careful if they put in a grid or put in a budget that they're paying $250 for a physician office visit. That is fair market value for an evaluation and management visit for a patient. If you bill that out in addition, you double dipped because an auditor will say you got fair market value from the sponsor and you also billed it to Medicare or a third-party payer. So it's okay for them to put a small amount in that's not comparable to fair market value, for Dr. Croswell to do a adverse event evaluation and go over concomitant meds, but it's not okay for him to get his fair market value for an E&M visit and then him bill it out as well. But make sure your physician practices know this because sometimes they're billing separate from the hospitals or the clinics that you're involved with. Yes?
What about billing for protocol deviations or hospitalizations caused by protocol deviations or non-compliance?
She wants to know what about hospital deviations or non-compliance. A lot of times what you have to do on those is you have to know what's in your contract and you have to know what the sponsor agrees to. Because if there's a sponsor involved, a pharma, they're likely going to give you the nod whether or not they'll pay. But if it's treating or preventing a complication, it's likely billable under the national coverage decision.
Right, but I was thinking more on just the investigator and their
Right.
and that causes,
Well, I think what you have to think about then, too, is what's your business rules for that? And I would say work with risk management and compliance if that happens as well at your institution, just to make sure you're covered. So you don't want to bill for services promised free in the informed consent. How many of you still have the word free in your informed consent? Anybody? If you do, take it out. If you've got at no cost, make sure you clarify what is being done at no cost, such as the EKG at screening. You can get down to that level of detail because then there's not going to be any question where the bill should go. And there's no auditor that's going to say, well, I can't tell. How could your patient tell? So be careful how you word your consent. You can't bill for services that are for research purposes only. Again, know what's buried in the protocol. You also can't bill for services that are part of a non-qualifying trial. And those do exist. And then you can't bill for Medicare Advantage plan. You can't bill Medicare Advantage plans when the claims are supposed to be directed to regular Medicare. Now, is there anybody in the room that did not know that Medicare Advantage plans do not cover drug clinical trials? Didn't know that? So take that home, because Medicare Advantage plans are suing hospitals and clinics all over the country to be paid back for clinical trial drug studies. Likely, if you've billed them and you've put the codes and modifiers on, you have probably received a denial. But the caveat with Medicare Advantage plans is in January of 2011, Medicare Advantage plans were then told that they had to pay the gap, the difference. So you have to manage that. You have to bill regular Medicare, revert the patient to regular Medicare for just the items and services that are within the study, not everything else over here, And if radiation is part of their treatment, but it's not part of the study, the radiation over here goes to Medicare Advantage. It's very confusing. You have to have a human being do this. Once you get your reimbursement in from Medicare, the secondary loaded should be Medicare Advantage, and Medicare Advantage then receives the bill for the gap or the difference. A lot of times it's small. It's less than $50. But if you don't have it set up correctly, guess what happens? Patients end up with those bills. And before they set this up, patients ended up with the higher copays. And what was happening was patients weren't going on clinical trials, or once they started getting their bills, they were dropping off study because they were having to pay more out of pocket. ASCO's pretty active in this area. At some point, I think Medicare Advantage is going to get enough pushback. But with the new provisions in the Affordable Care Act, all patients are going to be able to receive clinical trial care, and they're not going to be able to deny it, supposedly. When you talk to people in Washington, they look at you like you're speaking French when you say that, but it is in the Affordable Care Act. So, the basic rules is you have to be putting on the codes, modifiers, the condition code, the ICD-9 code, V70.7, on government payer patients that are on clinical trials. The payment system is different because if you have a patient that is on an inpatient study, let's just say for leukemia or lymphoma, they're paid on a DRG payment for your government payers. So what you don't want to do is start removing stuff from those bills, because once you remove stuff from non-government payer patients, you downcode your bill because they're not paid on a DRG. So know ahead before you start what is really research, and bill as much as you can that's routine to the payer. It's easier for you to manage. This is a HCFA 1450. This is an outpatient procedure bill for, actually this is for a device, but what you would do is it would have your procedures here, your HCPCS or CPT codes here, and what you would do is you would put, if all of this was part of the study, you would put a Q1 up this line by every single line item. Q1, 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 if it's part of the study. That's the proper way to submit a clinical trial bill. This is a HCFA 1500, a UB doctor visit. You see the doctor visit is here. They also did a research, part of the research study that was considered routine and customary or routine care, which is a venipuncture. And they put that on there to tell Medicare, we are billing you for this, and it's part of a study. And what this claim would have also had on it would have been the V70.7 and the condition code 30, which means participating in a clinical trial, and it's qualifying. So the answer in the coverage analysis is the same for physician and hospital. What I see when I do audits all over the country, and I do hundreds of these a year, the doctor's physician professional side is not in sync with the facility side. The facility has it right, but the physician is over here billing things that they don't know was paid for by study. And where you really get into complications is if there's more than one physician involved and you didn't tell them all, such as you have a pathologist, a surgeon, an anesthesiologist, all involved in the case, and something happens and they did something that was research. Hospital people, Rose removes it off the bill, but nobody told the three physicians, so they just bill that professional bill out normally, don't put any codes or modifiers, and then when the bill is looked at Medicare, it doesn't sync up with the technical side bill. You have to think about that the physician and the hospital side have to sync. They have to say the same thing. And if you have physicians doing research outside of your facility and they're sending patients in, you better know what you're supposed to be billing. Because your facility is billing a payer. So who would be splashed across the front page of the New York Times? It would be your facility. Your physician would be responsible because he signed or she signed the 1572. But who billed fraudulently? Whoever processed a claim. So if you're billing CMS, you do need the V70.7 and the condition code 30 and then the Q1 or Q0. I will just tell you that the code that you're going to have on the majority of your bills is Q1, because Q1 means it's a routine cost. You have a coverage review, and you know that you're allowed to bill it, and you're telling Medicare or a government payer you're billing it. You have to think about the 3 C's. This is what gets people in trouble everywhere. There was a lack of communication and coordination, and the stakeholders, all the people who needed to know about the study, didn't know. And this, guys, I've been at places that have filed, places that have filed bankruptcy because of the money they've had to pay back from a billing audit in cancer research. This is extremely serious, and if you think that you can't and you're doing too little to be on the radar, think again. And if you know that you're probably billing wrong, once you know, you have 60 days to figure it out and pay it back. So you can't be just you can't be oblivious to what's going on. You have to investigate and figure out what you need to do to fix it. The documents you need to coordinate, the consent, the billing plan, the budget, the contract, all the documents that the study has, the consent, budget, contract, coverage analysis has to be in your possession to do billing compliance. You got to know what's in the consent. If you're doing stuff without consents, you are definitely set up for some type of billing error. You have to think about the things that have to happen in the billing world, which the majority of you, probably it isn't you. Who does your billing at your facility? Do they know these rules? Are they putting these codes and modifiers? Do they know who the patients are? Do they know when they're on study? Do they know when they're coming in for an eye exam that has nothing to do with the study? Because if you don't tell them, they're not going to do the right thing. And if they think that they know and they're just going to put the codes and modifiers on everything, they're likely putting codes and modifiers on stuff they don't need to. And it's really important if you're doing Medicare Advantage patients, because you got to think about that flipping the bill over and doing something different. You got to bill all entities correctly. You cannot really, you have to think about, you can get in more trouble by billing the federal government incorrectly. But you shouldn't be billing anybody incorrectly. And if you're doing this process right, you won't be. You need to bill for the provided items or the services that cannot be billed. You need to let somebody know that those are free or are provided at no cost. You have to be federally compliant. And what I mean by that is you cannot charge a federal grant more than the Medicare rate. That is in the regs. You can charge more to a sponsor at fair market value, but according to the Office of Inspector General, it's up to you to defend how you came to that fair market value. It's not up to them to defend if you did. It's for you to say how you did it. And you have to be transparent. Communicate, be consistent, and be transparent in everything you do, and it will serve you well if you ever have a federal audit. Number 1, the consent form rules. I don't care what you do right, otherwise, if your consent is just a little shaky or doesn't really tell people what's going on, the consent form will win and you will have billed incorrectly. And if it's audited, you will pay back. The billing plan or coverage analysis should direct what you're doing. The billing plan should be the one to tell you, the coverage review, what needs to be billed to the federal payer and the third-party payers that are commercial. What should come off, what should go to the study account, or what has to be eaten by the physician or the hospital. The contract, delimits. You have to know what's in the contract. A contract can tell something along the lines of, you know, we're going to agree to pay for something, we're going to agree to provide. I hate contracts and budgets that are flat dollar amounts because I don't know what they're paying for. And I've seen federal auditors say, how did you come up with what they paid you for? And they're digging through the file trying to figure out what correspondence the sponsor had and what the sponsor told the site. And if you find things that are bad, you can always renegotiate. But once you start billing Medicare patients for a study, if you figure out you're doing it incorrect, it is best practice to maintain and keep billing the way you set it up. Okay, you're billing Medicare. You could have been billing this to Medicare, and you're really billing it to the study. And you figured out, well, gosh, we're losing money on this. We should have been billing this to the payer, because our third-party payment would have been higher. But you can't flip that midstream, because Medicare looks at that and goes, wait a minute, you got to treat all patients the same, and we want the best deal. And they don't like that. I've seen them have sites have to pay back. So your coding people, they have to know who the patients are and what is in your grid so they can put the codes, Q1s, on outpatient. They can tell the physician side, this EKG was paid for by the sponsor, so the reading needs to be billed to us instead of out. And then you have to think about the Medicare Advantage piece. Where does who's directing those bills? Who's making sure that they get billed correctly? And who's making sure that if they have items and services that are not part of the study actually does get billed to Medicare Advantage the right way it should? Because what I see at places is they take everything the patient's having while they're on study and flip it to regular Medicare, including radiation, surgery, everything else they've had. And really what was supposed to be converted over to regular Medicare was just the chemotherapy portion of their treatment, because that's what the study entailed.